One of my friends watched my debate with Paul Copan, and he sent me a nice email providing his thoughts on the debate. And who's generally, enjoyed the debate for sure. But one sentence got my attention, and I responded to him, and I thought you might benefit from my response as well. So I'm going to quote him and then read my response and expand upon it here. This is what he said in the email. Quote, Paul Copan would not admit the concrete brutalities involved in ancient Near Eastern conquests, and you would not touch the New Testament witness to Jesus being a bad guy, unquote. I think the first point is true about Paul, and my dog's barking. Please ignore him. And there's some truth in what he says about me not touching Jesus being a bad guy, but I want to unpack that part. So in terms of not addressing this idea of Jesus being a bad guy, so I said Paul depends on a method known as the Gish Gallop. Depends on is probably too strong. I probably should have said Paul Copan uses a method that is called the Gish Gallop, and that's a reference to Duane Gish. Duane Gish was a young Earth creationist, famous 40 years ago for debating neo-Darwinians and trying to poke holes in neo-Darwinian evolutionary theory. And in his debates, what Gish would do would raise in his statements multiple problems, specific problems with specific details of neo-Darwinian evolutionary theory, including gaps in the fossil record, things like that. And Gish would go through this long list, and he would certainly know that his opponent could not sufficiently deal with this whole list of issues he had raised. Even one of them, dealing with it adequately, might take several minutes. So by throwing all of these things out there that may not be directly germane to the specific debate they have, but just sort of selecting various topics that it would be great if neo-Darwinian evolution could explain, but maybe at this point it can't. By throwing all of those out, he would leave the audience with the impression that evolution is a theory in crisis, and this would thereby put his opponent on the defensive. And the opponent is now trying to bat back just a few of these things that Gish had raised. And so that's been called the Gish Gallop. So the idea being then I think Eugenie Scott, by the way, I think she's the one that came up with that term. I could be wrong. But that would create this, put the opponent on the defensive and create the impression that Gish had won the debate. Now, I'm not saying that Paul Copan intentionally, as a method, employs the Gish Gallop as such, but I'm saying functionally, the way he engages in the debate is equivalent to, it functions like a Gish Gallop. So Paul will let's say, to back up. So I'm raising objections, and the objections I'm pointing out is the implication of Paul's position is that the Israelites under divine command were committing war crimes, moral atrocities, like killing women, children, infants, mentally and physically handicapped, the elderly, and all other non-combatants. Any non-combatants that they could get their hands on, they would have killed. They would have stabbed them with their swords. They would have impaled them with their spears. And now, if you're okay with that, I mean, okay, then we could have another conversation about some other things that I would have to say. But many people are not going to be comfortable with that as an implication of their hermeneutic. And so I think under very good ethical and theological grounds, they're going to look for another hermeneutic. And that's my point, is to say, let's at least get to the ground level of recognizing the implication of Paul's position. And Paul, and I'm going to talk more about this point in a subsequent video. Paul just didn't have good rebuttals, in my view, to what I was saying. He engaged, I think, in special pleading by arguing somehow that there were no civilians at all in the cities in Jericho or Ai, or trying to take the position that when the Canaanites are being driven out of the land, that somehow whenever the Israelites happen to catch Canaanites, that they would somehow the civilians would not have been killed. I mean, In fact, I pointed out in the debate, the sources that Paul quotes in his books directly contradict him. And the specific example I gave, a couple examples, well, the one specific example I gave was Kenneth Kitchen, who says that among those who would have been killed would have been the less mobile inhabitants. He doesn't say soldiers. He says less mobile inhabitants, which is a euphemism for saying anybody who is not quick enough to get away from the Israelite armies would have been killed by those armies. That includes all of the civilians I just described, the most vulnerable people, like the elderly, the handicapped, small children, infants, and so on, would have been killed by the Israelite soldiers. That's what Kenneth Kitchen says, who Paul Copan quotes in his book, Did God Really Command Genocide? So I think that Paul Copan, and I was hoping that he would just own that and say, okay, on my view, yes, God commands this, and the Israelites under divine command are killing babies and small children and elderly people and handicapped people. He just wouldn't go there, however. Instead, what Paul would do is he would say, well, one of the things he would do is say, well, list a bunch of things that Jesus said in the New Testament that appear to be violent. And so then my friend in his email was saying, and you wouldn't address the things that Paul was raising. Well, so the reason I wouldn't do that is, first of all, because Paul's what I want to keep hammering on is the central issue under debate, which Paul Copan would not concede, but which I think he has to concede to avoid egregious special pleading and actual contradiction with his own sources, which is simply to concede that, yeah, in his view, God commanded the killing of civilians and the Israelites carried it out. But instead, Paul wanted to shift the attention, I think, to the New Testament documents. So here's what I said to my friend. The thing that is that Paul's list includes, among other things, Jesus using stark metaphors for hortative warning of future judgment, obscure eschatological language, hyperbole, selective use of imprecatory psalms, etc. What Jesus never does is directly affirm the commission of war crimes like slaughtering civilians. So Copan's talking points, in my view, are a red herring, not directly germane to the debate at hand. It's like a Gish Gallop. Jesus, Paul Copan talks about in Revelation 2, John has Jesus talking about bringing judgment and laying down the individual on a bed of sickness, for example. It's a very provocative image that he quotes. But that's an eschatological language, figurative language talking about judgment, which could be restorative judgment. What it's not talking about is Jesus saying to a soldier who has a sword standing over a small child, yeah, kill that small child. That's not what Jesus is saying. He never says things like that. So to use this language, which we could take time to unpack and describe within its eschatological context or within a hortative context of preaching about future judgment and so on, and the nature of that future judgment theologically, those are all interesting questions and important questions, which we could certainly discuss, but they're not the same kind of thing as God directing soldiers to carry out war crimes on civilians. So to conclude, I said to my friend, I might have taken more time to address these issues if Copan had conceded that his view entails that the Israelites carried out this killing of civilians as part of the occupation of the land. But incredibly, to my mind, he wouldn't concede that. And thus, I was forced to keep hammering on the point. And then I concluded with this. It's like not letting a Jehovah's Witness avoid the meaning and implications of John 1:1. Now, I'm not comparing Paul Copan to a Jehovah's Witness in terms of theology or anything like that, of course. My point is that when I would debate with a Jehovah's Witness, and you say to them, you quote John and says, the Word was with God and the Word was God, and in your translation, the New World Translation, that says the Word was a God and inserts this totally illegitimate indefinite article into the Greek, which isn't there, that we have to deal with that, right? That the text is not saying John 1:1 that Jesus is a lesser being, but that's what you're saying. Now, if a Jehovah's Witness were just to say, yeah, but in this other passage, Jesus says, I am greater, or the Father's greater, I am lesser, or he didn't know the time of his return, I would say, yeah, I'd happy to talk about those texts, but I want to hear what you have to say about John 1:1. And if that person's not going to have a response to John 1:1, I'm going to keep hammering on that before we can get to those other texts. And so it's about having a focus on what you want to achieve and what you believe to be the central issues of debate are. Having said all that, Paul may very well have a different understanding of what the debate exactly was about, but this is my understanding of the debate. It was on Old Testament warfare, the killing of Canaanites, and so that's where we had to camp, and we had to get some agreement there before we're going to move on and talk about these other issues. And just to conclude with this, I think Hermeneutics 101 is that you interpret passages that are less clear by way of passages that are more clear. And so if you want to understand the implications of Paul Copan's position, you don't start by focusing on an obscure reference in Revelation 2 about Jesus being quoted there as in the revelator's vision of bringing forth some sort of future judgment using this veiled language. What you talk about are things like actual Israelite soldiers standing on the dusty ground of Canaan with a sword over a cowering woman trying to protect her children. And if they're on their view, that involves that soldier killing that woman and her small children, that's pretty concrete. That's what we need to talk about. And so that's where the debate should have been focused, and certainly where I tried to focus it. In a subsequent video to this, I am going to make another point about where I think really the focus for Copan's rebuttal should be against me. And that will, so keep your eye out for that video.